Well, Sam Burrows, welcome to the Christian Education Podcast.
Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. I think you may be one of our first international guests, which is great. I think New Zealand still counts as international. Would you agree?
According to New Zealand, we definitely would count ourselves as international, but maybe the rest of the world are unsure about whether we're a state of Australia or not, which is a little bit depressing.
Oh, dude. Oh, look, it's funny, isn't it? Because if we were different countries, and of course we are, the news hot off the press, actually, Sam, is that you are defecting in some way or other. You're actually coming over to the West Island and setting up shop over here. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing over in Australia in the coming years?
I love that you called me. What did you call me? A defector.
I mean, only nice things by that term.
Yeah. I mean, there's stronger words some Kiwis might use, like traitor. But that's true. I'm moving over to Sydney at the start of next year, so very excited to go to a slightly warmer climate, and it'll be a nice change.
Yeah, and that's right. So before we get stuck into the meat of our discussion today, which I certainly am looking forward to, I'd like to just dive into, Sam, your background in Christian education, how you got into it, what makes you passionate about it. So as sort of generic as it is, can you just tell us a little bit about what it is you do with yourself?
Yeah, okay. Well, I can tell you how I got in, and it sort of will lead us to where we are now. I didn't know what I was going to do when I left school, so I went to England for a year, and when I got back, still didn't know. So my mum actually stuck me into a teaching program, and I thought, great, I'll give it a year, and if I don't like it, I'll just do something else. But it turned out I really got hooked, and my first lecturer was a guy called Rod Thompson, which will be known to a few people in Aussie, and he really inspired me not only to get into teaching, but to understand the Bible, understand culture and philosophy. And that's when I really started my love for learning. So finished my degree, went and taught in a Christian school for 3 years. And then I went and worked for a church for a couple of years doing young adult ministry. Went back into teaching for another 3 years. And then, I'd studied a little bit of theology in between as well. Ended up being a deputy principal of a little school just north of Auckland, and during that time got asked to start lecturing into a tertiary program, which was a combination of theology and education. And that's where I really started to, really started to hum, and eventually ended up at Laidlaw College doing full-time lecturing in our education program. So I've been doing that for the last 4 years. And during that time, I have, made friends with a lot of Christian schools around New Zealand, and ended up making friends with CEN, which was really cool, and been over to Australia a few times. And it's been really good to see what's going on in Australia as well. So, yeah, I guess it's been one of those things that I've just, continued to grow into, and it's been a fun journey.
I think one of the great things about being a Christian is having a full appreciation for God's A, sense of humor, and B, the sort of narratival arc that he places in your life. Because oftentimes, like many characters in the movies we'll talk about today, you can be traveling through life and you go, I do not know what the dickens is going on here. Like, I think I'm doing the right thing. This feels right, but it just, I'm not quite sure what's going on. And then you look back in 5 years in the fullness of time and you go, wow, I couldn't be happier with where I am. And it's just God's kindness and God's goodness that I've landed here. That certainly sounds like that's been part of your story. And you said you're coming across to Australia. So after a really rich medley of things you've had going on in New Zealand, what exactly is it that you'll be doing in Australia?
Yeah, apart from learning a little bit more about rugby league, probably I'm going to be working for CN as the Director of Professional Learning. So nice fancy title, and I'll just be, coordinating some of the professional development that goes around the CN network in Australia. So a really cool challenge and a nice chance to bring some of the things I've been doing together. So it'll be good.
And you feel like as you embrace a new role, something like that, new role, new country, do you get the really tangible feeling that, actually, again, in God's kindness and goodness, a lot of the things that I've been doing up until this point are going to set me up to do this next job really, really well?
Oh, totally. I think that's the exciting thing, is that I've got so many ideas. So it'll be a really cool opportunity to try something cool.
All right, well, let's get stuck into the meat of our conversation then, Sam. We're, of course, talking about an article that you've written for the Christian Teachers Journal. You've titled your article, Authenticity, Formation, and the Multiverse. Now, that is a catchy title. There are going to be listeners who are thinking, I've heard, when it comes to Christian ed, I've heard a lot about authenticity, and I've heard a whole heck of a lot about formation. But what exactly does this have to do with the multiverse? So I guess just to start off, for the less sci-fi literate amongst us, could you explain what the multiverse even is, and perhaps share with us what that might have to do with Christian education?
Yeah, maybe I'm just a master of clickbait. Maybe that's all it is. But no, the multiverse is really obviously it's something that's been popping up in a whole bunch of sci-fi and Marvel movies over the last few years. To the point where I think we're sort of looking at media and thinking, is every movie and TV series about the multiverse at the moment? It certainly feels like that to me. So my question began to be, well, what on earth is going on? So there are a few different ways you could answer that question. Like maybe it's a response to the internet. We're being presented with a whole bunch of ideas about what all these different realities, or maybe it's an idea of social media where we get an insight into all these different worlds and lives, or maybe it's just, media conglomerates that want to exploit our nostalgia by just generating endless content from their IPs that they've acquired. So you can take that really cynical view, but I think that this focus on the multiverse, and which I said in the article, is actually a way of exploring this anxiety that I think that we've grown to acquire, which is, what am I doing with my life, and did I make the right choices? Which is all about self-authoring. And so the multiverse is this metaphor, this powerful metaphor, which is actually our way of working out this anxiety, I think, which is, hey, the only person who's in charge of your life is you. You better make a good life out of that. So, life is what you make it, but also life is what you make it. So, make it good.
That's a fascinating insight. And I remember talking with Stephen McAlpine. You'll be familiar with some of his work, where he was actually saying he linked those two concepts in the same way you did. He talked about the fact that we've got more agency, more freedom than ever. We've got the ability to, in many ways, create almost out of nothing these personalities, construct them from ourselves. However, with that, while it looked quite shiny on the packet, when we actually unwrap it and try and do it, we see a tremendous burden. And that's the burden that you're talking about here as self-authoring. And we're starting to realize, well, perhaps we weren't meant to be the ones who author ourselves. You talk in your article, actually, one of Taylor Swift's, in her commencement speech to the New York University students, you said, we're all writers, and it can be really overwhelming to figure out who to be and when. Who you are now and how to act in order how to get sort of where you want to go. I've got some good news. It's all up to you. This is what Taylor Swift is saying to the students. And she also says, I've got some terrifying news. It's totally up to you. So that's going to sound pretty interesting to sort of the average age of the sort of the average cohort of teachers in Australia, which is about 50 years old. My question for you, Sam, what kind of stresses or pressures are our current students feeling, do you think, around self-authoring that maybe the previous generation of people may not have felt?
Yeah, well, you may have to indulge me in doing a little bit of work in history, if that's all right. So one of the interesting things to know is, I think, really that this isn't just out of nowhere. So really, if you could track it for the last 500 years, but we'll try and narrow it down to the last 100 years or so. And you see some really interesting shifts going on in culture. One of them is at the beginning of World War One, you see queues of young men across Europe queuing up at train stations, often stretching for miles to go to war. And the reasons that they're doing that is because they believe in the reasons that they're going to war. They're going for king and country, for virtue, for honor and sacrifice and empire. These big external words that they believed in. But their experience when they finally get to the battlefield is pretty it's pretty, it shifts their brain completely, because they see their mates being blown up on battlefields, seemingly for no reason. They're getting eaten alive by rats and maggots and frostbitten to death. And for the first time in history, actually, those words like king and country, empire, sacrifice, virtue, and honor, they actually ring hollow, because they're like, well, what was the point of that? So that was a massive, big shift in the mind of people across the Western world when it came to those experiences. You then fast forward to World War II, you see the nuclear bomb being dropped, and actually a progress myth, which had been through our technology and I guess political expertise and medicine, we're going to end up conquering the world. And so this was this big external narrative that we believed in. And then our greatest technological achievement, to split the atom, ended up in the most hellish scene that we've ever seen. And so these big externals that we believed in, whether they be virtues or stories like progress, they actually began to really crumble. And so what we began to do is think, well, we can't trust in these big externals anymore. Where are we going to look? Well, we're going to look internally now, because externals don't work. So we began to look inside, and obviously the 60s were like that. But you fast forward a few decades to where we are now, and actually that's gone into hyperdrive, which is, the only place I can really trust is inside myself. And so, a Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor, would actually say he'll call that the massive subjective turn. We've gone inside. It's all about our own sense of what's right and wrong. And that's led us to, again, what I quoted, which is the age of authenticity. And I think, to answer your question finally, what does this mean for the average teacher in Christian education? It's just to know that I think probably what we're seeing with Gen Z is the absolute pinnacle or peak of what that is. And this is this complete reliance on yourself, which has led to, it'd be fair to say, a little bit of resignation, a little bit of despair, and very hard to hold on to hope, because there is nothing outside you. Now, I think there are some different shifts going on. So the article is very much a snapshot, but that's probably given you enough to speak back to, I guess.
Wow, it's a tale of two Taylors, isn't it? We've got Taylor Swift and Charles Taylor, the two perhaps great philosophers of our age. So it's interesting to see them in the same conversation. It is very interesting, isn't it, when you've got people, and you allude to this in your article. I think it's a fascinating concept. People still have a strong moral guiding principle that they seem to be acting according to. However, they've lost a transcendent anchor point. So it's almost like they are steering their boat, and then North Star, the guiding star, is just a small LED on the bow of their ship. And so there's no real external anchor point, and it seems to be actually backfiring. You will be as across the statistics as anyone, I'm sure, Sam. But what we see is unprecedented rates of anxiety and depression, and a whole lot of pathologies that are really rearing their heads. Do you think the burden of self-authorship and the weight of having to construct your own identity and direction and be the main character, do you think that's actually starting to show some pretty significant cracks in our younger cohort of students?
Yeah, I think it is starting to show some cracks, and I don't think all of those cracks are bad news, actually. So what's really interesting is that, I went to speak to a group of students in a Christian school a couple of months ago, and the teachers asked me to speak to the students about deconstruction. I was like, oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a millennial. I know all about deconstruction. It's been one of the themes of our demographic, So I got up there in front of all these students. It was a packed room, and I was like, so deconstruction. And none of these kids knew what that word even meant. And it struck me, actually, that what happened is we've actually moved on. There's nothing that these young people are really deconstructing from. There's no assumed knowledge that they're actually taking with them. In some ways, I think in culture generally, it wouldn't be the same in Christian schools, but in culture generally, there is no biblical literacy. There is no cultural awareness of biblical stories, or there's no biblical literacy. And so in some ways it's good, because I think millennials carried a little bit of hangover towards church, and they sort of were a little bit disillusioned, and they reacted against it. And we now have this post-Christian ex-evangelical movement going on that, is into craft beer and tattoos. But these kids don't have that. They don't have this experience. And so they're actually asking the big questions almost from a bit of more of a blank slate. And what that means is, I think, is that yes, they're seeing the hollow nature of trying to be your own guiding light, and it actually means they're now looking again for something a little bit more stable. So, I guess my argument that I didn't have time in the article to talk about is I think we've moved from modern to postmodern, which is a railing against big narratives, to now we're moving into a meta-modern moment, which means I think there's this new openness to something that feels a little bit more transcendent, something that might be able to explain where we are a little bit better, an openness to meaning in a real sense and not just one that I've constructed. So I think that's actually a really positive opening that we're into now, and very, very interesting for us that have been used to talking about postmodernism for such a long time.
That is a fascinating distinction, isn't it? And if we're not aware to the cultural difference, I mean, I'm 30, 33, somewhere around there, and I consider myself as a pretty young bloke. But if I am not careful, I can quite easily assume that the people that I'm teaching who are 16, 17-year-olds are actually thinking the same way as I am. If I've got myself rather charitably categorized as a young person and them in the same category, but actually it is crazy the difference. I often talk about school teaching, especially in a Christian school, as cross-cultural ministry. And we can fail to realize that it is cross-cultural because most of them look like us and come from the same sort of areas we do. But man, that cultural gap is huge, and probably we can get mucked around by it even more so than if we were going to teach in Burkina Faso, because we're actually not wise to the fact that there is a cultural gap there. So if I'm a millennial, and you alluded to this when you're talking about deconstruction and these guys are sort of double clicking on that and getting nothing. If I'm a millennial out there or even a little bit older, what are some of the things I need to be keeping in mind as I'm engaging with these younger generation of students so that we're not just completely talking past each other the whole time?
Yeah, I actually really love this question because I've actually given a lot of time to this question because, I mean, one thing that I've tried to do is, I've been in this academic world, but I wanted to dip my toes in the water still, and so I've taken on a youth group for the last couple of years, and I've had to really work with this and realize that I can't really draw on a lot of my own experience to bring it to these guys. It's just a completely different world. When I was a youth leader, when I was in youth group, you'd be able to, God loves you, don't do anything silly, and let's play chubby bunnies, and that was probably okay. But these kids are highly politicized. They sort of really know what's going on. They're exposed to every idea, and they're really plugged into, I think, social issues in a way that I certainly wasn't. I was sort of, more interested in girls than anything else, and it's very different. So I think there's some big differences here. Like being a millennial myself, I really grew up in the 90s, and the 90s were this golden moment for the Western world. It was Starbucks on every corner, McDonald's was booming, we had Friends, we had the Fresh Prince, we had the Spice Girls. It was a good time. And globally, this is where globalization really took off, and I don't really even mean just in the way it operated, but we really believed in the global story, this myth that we'd actually moved into a new era. We'd hold hands, sing Kumbaya across the world. It was going to be okay. And there were writers like Francis Fukuyama that were writing things like, the end of man or something. I can't remember what it was called, but we'd moved into an economic world, essentially, post-war world. And we actually really, I think, believed that. And so it was this golden time. But then 9/11 happened, and 9/11 really reminded us that that's actually not the way the world is. It's full of conflict. It's full of clashing stories, and it wasn't as easy to work out as we thought it was. So, we have these kids that have not been brought up in the 90s. They've been brought up in the shadow of 9/11, in the shadow of 2 recessions, in the shadow of other political leaders becoming quite disappointing. Now you've, in the shadow of a pandemic at a really crucial time in their lives, and now you've got Ukraine, and you've got the issue with Israel and Palestine, and you're sort of thinking, for people my age, our default was the world's pretty okay, and then bad stuff happens. But for these kids, it's like the world was actually never okay. Bad stuff always happens. So their whole view of the world is far darker, and far, I guess, more open to despair. And I think, I often think of the question like, is it that they see actually reality more for what it is than we did? I think there's definitely an element to that. And so I think we got to be really good at talking about hope in a real sense. And the Bible's great with this, where it's like terrible things will happen. Can you trust God and hope anyway? And I think we're being forced to really reckon with hope in a really true biblical sense now.
That's a really fascinating observation. And I mean, you're right. There is so much, you talk about hope in a biblical sense. There's so much hope in the scriptures. You read 1 Peter, he's the apostle of hope, many people have called him. And there's so much data, and hope in a hopeless world really does shine quite brightly. I'll be interested to hear what you think of this, Sam. I have an older friend. He's about 50 years old, right? And he is still part of the sort of house church movement, house church, extremely low church. He's saying, who's going to walk into a church these days, right? Who's actually going to go into one of those buildings and see a pastor with a dog collar? No one's getting excited by that stuff anymore, okay? So what do we need to do? Well, we need to make our church as much like just an ordinary thing as possible. So we're going to have it in a completely neutral place. We're going to have it in a library. We're not going to have big, lengthy sermons. We might not even sing. And what he's trying to do, I guess, is remove a lot of these more alien features. Yet, I've seen a couple of the younger people I know, so in the 17, 18, 19 bracket, convert to Christianity recently. And interestingly enough, what subgenre of Christianity did they convert to? Eastern Orthodoxy. All right. And if they wear their transcendence on their sleeve, there is no doubt about that. They've got these pictures, these icons of the saints. It smells wild. I went along to one of those services. It smells absolutely wild in those places. You've got the smells. The priest is dressed in this stuff that is so unlike anything you would see. They're wearing their transcendence on their sleeve, and people are actually loving it. So you've got these conflicting impulses. One guy's going, let's make it as normal as possible. But actually what we see in the youth of today is that they're trying to reach out and grasp something that is as transcendent. I teach year 7 Christian studies, for example. And what do the students want to talk about a lot? They want to talk about angels and demons and miracles, and they're fascinated by the stuff that is so different and alien. They're almost craving the transcendent. So that's a generational gap that I have observed there. Does that sort of stack up with how you perceive these different generations interacting with one another?
Yeah, I mean, the data that's just come out of the Faith and Belief Survey for Australia and New Zealand definitely shows that people are far more open to institutional religion. Like, we've seen a bit of a slump in trust in institutions in the past few decades, but it seems to be on a bit of an upswing. And to be honest, though, like, the public intellectuals that young people are turning to are all about transcendence and all about trying to find that order. And so this is why you have such a big uptake with people like Jordan Peterson, because he's basically introducing order back to reality, introducing the transcendent into psychology. Now, I'm not here to advocate for him. I think there's some pretty big differences between how I use scripture and he does, and how he uses the word God and all that kind of stuff. But it is interesting to see that happening. They're very different from the way that millennials were. Millennials really were railing against the system. I think Gen Z are wanting to find something that can bring meaning back. So, yeah, I think I'd push against the house church. That sounds like a very millennial answer to things. And actually, I think they want to see you. I think that's the thing. It's authenticity combined with something substantial will really speak, but it's not authenticity for its own sake. It's authenticity aiming for something real.
I think that's a very salient observation. Now, as we close, one of the interesting things that we talked about earlier, I mentioned that I thought of teaching as cross-cultural ministry. It's definitely a ministry. As Christian educators, we can get on board with that fact. However, it's far more cross-cultural than many of us realize. And what I see in you, and what you've done so well, Sam, is that you really have your finger on the pulse of this culture. You seem, I was reading your article, and it was an absolute baptism into these cultural references, most of which had completely flown right over my head. So first of all, my congratulations to you for being able to keep abreast of all this sort of stuff. But as we're looking to understand and care for and love these young people, we need to know how they think. All right. We need to read the scripture, but we also need to read the culture. When it comes to reading culture, something you do so well, what tips do you have for the average bystander, such as myself, who's just trying to get a few handholds on this thing?
Okay, that's a really hard question, actually. I mean, I could just say what I do. I think part of it is actually just listening to the young people, but it's actually learning to also. This is going to be so obvious, but the internet really is their primary reality. And I mean, this is one of the things that has come out of all the research too. It's for millennials. We have our internet world and we have the real world. And the real world is our primary reality, and the internet is our secondary reality, even if it might be a major secondary reality. For Gen Z, it's the other way around. They are in both worlds, but the internet is their primary reality. And, you know, I've had kids in my youth group send me their screenshots of their screen time, and one girl had 10.5 hours one day in her holidays where she was online, and one boy had watched the equivalent of 36 24-hour days of TikTok between January to June. And so that actually has a massive effect. And so actually the internet is where it's all happening. And so, I mean, there's these crazy things going on. I mean, one of the big things is how it's constructing what it means to be male and female. And so as a kickback to a lot of the ways that masculinity is felt to have been eroded, you have these new masculinities rising up against it. So these more toxic, you know, dominating forms of masculinity around people like Andrew Tate, which is like, we'll just kind of dominate women and we'll be an alpha male, not a beta male or a sigma male, and all these weird words that are turning up. And that really asks some pretty serious questions about what does Christ say to masculinity. And similarly, you got some things on the girl side of stuff, which is, you know, you got these new trends coming through like girl dinner and girl math and hot girl summer and things like that. And actually, these are the ways that they're constructing meaning and communicating with each other. And just actually, I hate to say it, but memes are actually really important. If they're kind of like the primary way that young people are communicating, decoding those memes, it might sound like a silly little hobby, but it's actually very, very important. And then obviously paying attention to the way that these young people are expressing themselves through song as well. So there are a few key artists that I'd definitely look to, but the thing is, 10 or 15 years ago, we used to be able to say, this is what culture is like, and it would be true for about 5 years. What I'm finding is that something may be true for like 3 months, and then you've got to look at it again, and you've got to look at it again because it keeps moving really fast. And this cross-cultural mission thing you're talking about, it's not as easy as it used to be. And so you're either someone like me who's a freak and finds that a little bit fun, or you're going to feel really overwhelmed by it. So I think try and be a little bit online, but not too online, and definitely talk to your kids and get them to feed back to you what it all means, because sometimes it is just bizarre.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Sam. And I think it's a great piece of advice there to be sort of listening in, keeping your finger on the pulse, understanding the memes. Man, I tell you what, I read something the other day that said one of the most persuasive elements of the Reformation was small posters with an image and text on them that were plastered all around the place and were very persuasive in changing people's mind. And you just go, man, that's a meme. These guys were meme lords. That's crazy. Yeah. The Reformation was won by memes. Who knows? Maybe the second Reformation and revival will come through memes. I've got my hopes. So that's really good. And I guess my encouragement, I'm nowhere near as practiced at this as you are, Sam. But sort of two reflections. This is also where I'm glad of the body. I'm glad of the body of Christ, because I don't think I could get as across this as you are. Yet I'm glad we have people like you, and I'm certainly glad. I mean, it's New Zealand's loss, but Australia's gain. You're coming over to these CEN schools, of which I'm a part, and I'm sure you'll be able to help us keep abreast of these things. But B, I see within myself definitely a species of snobbery. It's so easy, you know, one day the grade 10s will walk into your classroom and they'll all be doing or saying this one thing. And you go, man, what a bunch of potato heads. Like, yeah, okay, so they saw something on TikTok or whatever. But it's actually interesting to step back and go, no, actually, I'm not judging the culture. I'm understanding the culture. And hopefully in understanding it, I'm going to get opportunities to present Christ in a compelling way and to apply Christ in a way that makes sense to those people. Now, before we wrap up here, Sam, is there anywhere people can go if they go, man, this Sam Burrows guy, this guy is on fire? Is there anywhere people can go to hear more of you or read more of what you've written?
Wow, that's really great. Imagine if that happened. At this stage, not really. I mean, maybe next year when I'm over and have a little bit more time for this kind of thing, I might put something together. But you know, at this point, you're just going to have to sit in that longing. You know, how long, oh Lord, for that? So.
Look, yeah, as I said, it's been a real treat talking with you. I certainly look forward to seeing you in Australia in the coming years. And we pray that God blesses you richly in all your endeavours over here.
Thank you. I was just thinking it might be a good thing to end with a quote on what we've talked about. Is that okay?
Please.
Okay, sweet. So there's this great quote by a theologian called Kevin Van Hooser. And you might think, oh, maybe we don't need to do this thing, keeping up with young people's culture. But I love this quote. He says in his book, Everyday Theology, he says, I cannot love my neighbor unless I understand him and the cultural world he inhabits. Cultural literacy, the ability to understand patterns and product of everyday life, this is an integral part of obeying the law of love. So probably what I'd say is keeping on top of youth culture and everything that's happening is actually a way of loving our students. So yes, it's hard work, but, you know, if we're doing it for them.
Beautiful, Sam. Well, that's right. Anything done in the service of our neighbour, even if it's watching the latest Spider-Man movie, is something that the Lord will smile upon and we will not have to give an account of on the last day. So you've sanctified many a Netflix evening. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Sam. It's been great to talk with you. And look, I'm sure we'll see you again sometime on the Christian Education Podcast.
Look forward to it.